So we have the honor today of having Jeremiah Prummer, an experienced entrepreneur, the CEO of KnoCommerce, one of the best tools to know more about your customers. Like I just said before, I use this on a daily basis. It saved my life so many times. It's a game changer. And I'm super excited to have you here today, Jeremiah. And I'm hoping that at the end of all this, we can all be survey kings. So yeah, thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. It's really great chatting with you. And I appreciate, I mean, you and the whole team at ConversionWise have been awesome to work with. And yeah, I'm hoping I can learn a little bit from you here as well.
Love it. Likewise, working with your team, super responsive as well all the time. So it's a walk in the park. Love it. So every great story has an interesting start, right? I'd love to go back at your beginning. You've been an entrepreneur
Yep.
for many years. You've had a couple of successful exits. What do we need to
Mhm.
know about Jeremiah that would explain why and how you got where you are today?
I think a lot of it goes back to my childhood, honestly. And so when I was 6 years old, I'm the oldest of four. So I was six. My youngest sibling was about 6 months old. My parents took a loan out on their home to open a small health food store, and so they took every penny they had, scraped it together, and they started this little store. And I basically grew up in that from the time I was six on. I started working there every summer when I was 10 and just learned a lot about entrepreneurship from watching my parents go through it. And I always I loved it. I think it's funny being one of four, like all four of us have very different experiences of our childhood, even though we were raised by the same parents and essentially the same circumstances. But it's interesting because I absolutely loved it. My siblings, I would say probably didn't love it as much.
Oh,
And yeah, just different personalities, right? Like, so there's something also just like in my personality that embraces this in a different way. And so grew up in that, and I think I started working there when I was 10, in the summers, and then as I got older, put in more hours, more time, but would work, on the weekends oftentimes as well. And I remember as a kid, I always thought that I could do it better than my dad. And that was my teenage arrogance. In retrospect, I had no idea what I was doing. But I thought that was kind of interesting. I always had ideas. I had ways that I wanted to do things and see things. And so when I got to college, I kind of got into building websites and playing around with the internet. And this is like 2005-ish that I started getting into that a little bit. And I went to college, and in 2010 started my first startup with a couple of friends. And it was one of my friends, it was his idea. We kind of went through a few different iterations of the company. We did like coupons basically. We did, man, I don't remember everything we did, but we basically settled on text message marketing was the thing that we started doing. This is 2011, 2012 when we got to that point. And so it was very early. We were kind of trying to create like a Twitter-like experience for SMS. The idea being that like you could subscribe to local news feeds and get deals and discounts and all of that. And then a component of it obviously was like businesses sending text messages to their customers. And the only people we could convince to use it were politicians. And so it was kind of funny. I mean, now it's like text message marketing is normal, right? Everybody uses it. But at the time, people were like, why would I text my customers? People are going to hate it, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I mean, things have changed in the last 13 years on that front. But it was fun. We lost all of our money. It didn't go very well. And so just we all went to work for startups, but that was kind of the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey.
I love the beginning, what you said, four kids and everyone has a completely different experience. One loves it, one hates it,
Yep.
but you're essentially going through the same thing. Um,
Yep.
so I was wondering actually as well, maybe you already answered that a little bit, but the reason you were so, you are so keen on entrepreneurship and all that, is it because you grew up in that and you saw like even weekends, like I'm working, it's normal, and as maybe other people, they saw like, okay, weekend, I can relax, I can go out, I can
Mhm.
party, whatever. And you just work
Yeah.
all the time. So maybe that sort of built your mindset for the years to come. Is that one of the reasons you think you've been maybe more successful than others, or are there also other things that maybe come into play?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't actually thought about that too much, to be honest, but I do think there is an element of that. I also like before my parents opened the store, my dad, like, he worked at a gas station when I was a kid, so like making minimum wage. He then my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She'd been a teacher, but she stayed at home with us kids, and we basically had nothing. My dad had another job after that, but he worked long hours all the time to feed the family. We had government assistance, all kinds of stuff, and we didn't have any money. And really we didn't have money. It wasn't until I graduated high school that like my teenage years we had a little bit more. But it wasn't until like after I left the house that my family had any sort of money. And now my dad's pretty well off, but my childhood wasn't like that. And I think that's part of it. Like there's a little bit of like we never had anything outside of the business. And so we just kind of we spent a lot of time doing that. I did sports as well, which I do think that helps a little bit. There's a bit of like a competitiveness. I do like to compete for sure. Friendly competition as much as possible, but competition is always fun. So I definitely picked up a little bit from that too. But yeah, I think like I saw my parents put in long hours. I put in long hours. I mean, when I was 17 years old, I was working 60, 70 hours a week in the summer. So like I got used to working like that. I actually don't work as much now as I used to because I have a family of my own. But yeah, it's like I do think there's something there. I hadn't really thought about that angle before, but certainly I think watching my parents work hard and then also needing to work hard to get the things that I wanted had an impact.
I love that answer. I found it super. I didn't know, that sort of story. I think you said, you love competition. I think we can also see that when you said you thought you could do it better than your dad, which at the beginning, I think also
Yeah.
that sort of, like you said, teenage maybe arrogance is a good thing because
Yeah.
maybe if you keep that long enough, you have that confidence. You're going to take challenges that
Mhm.
other people maybe wouldn't take, and then at the end,
Yeah.
you're sort of the one, that's sort of successful. So I think
Hmm.
that's super interesting. Also, maybe if you said, you didn't have a lot before, you just want to make sure you're never there again. If you're used to also working long, long hours, it's a bit used to, you're used to sort of that routine.
Yeah.
If you can now explain a little bit before we go into newcomers and sort of some tactical
Mhm.
sort of post-purchase survey questions, how
Yeah.
did newcomers actually come about? What are the steps just before you actually got into that story?
Yeah. So after my startup went under, I went to work for a company that was doing online scheduling. So basically like a software company for mostly like hairstylists and massage therapists and people like that. And then at the same time, I started building websites for friends and family. And so I had a friend, his mom needed an e-commerce site and I never built one before. And so this is 2012 into building a site with WooCommerce. So I don't know if you're familiar with WooCommerce, but yeah, I kind of built on top of like the WordPress ecosystem. And so that was my first experience. And I remember I decided I wanted to launch an extension for WooCommerce. And I honestly didn't really have anything I was that passionate about except just launching an extension. So I went and I found the snippet of code that it was a forum for WooCommerce where people were asking, how do I add a cart icon to the menu of my website? And like it's just like a super upvoted forum. I went and I found or this particular thread rather was very upvoted. There was a lot of people looking for this thing. And so I just took a code snippet, added it to an extension for WooCommerce with some different settings, and launched it as a free plugin. And instantly I started getting downloads. And this guy from the Netherlands actually reached out to me and it was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about making this a paid product?" And I said, "Well, I was thinking about making some other stuff, but sure, let's do it." And so we teamed up and we spent a few weeks working on a paid version of this and we launched it. And that was my first business in the e-commerce space. So I actually that was called WP Overnight, just extensions for WooCommerce stores. It still exists today. And we launched a bunch of different stuff, and we spent a few years working together on that. I was doing consulting stuff on the side as well. And then I sold to him in 2016 because I wanted to start my own brand. So I did the brand thing for a little bit, lost all my money, went into debt. It did not work out well. I was a little too ambitious and didn't know what I was doing. I tried to scale before product market fit essentially and just lost all my money. And so that was a good lesson. And then from there, I did some agency work for a little bit. And then when the pandemic hit, my friend Pearson Crass is his name. He owns an agency called Lunar Solar Group, and we had been we first connected probably in like 2013 ish when he was a brand owner. And I did some work for him over the years, and so when and helped him with his agency a little bit. And so pandemic hit, and we said, hey, let's build a tech company together. And so we kind of went through a bunch of different things. And one of the big problems, and I know you deal with this all the time now, so you'll totally get this, but one of the big problems is we know a lot about customers from like online customers from a what they purchased side of things. So we know the types of products they bought, how often they buy, lifetime value, all these kinds of things. So we have a really good sense of those kinds of things, but we don't know much about who they are, what motivates them, why it is that they actually make these purchases. And so our hypothesis, or not hypothesis really, but like the idea was like, how can we take this problem that we've both had for a decade plus in e-commerce and go out and solve this problem? And so that was where the survey platform concept came from. And really the vision has been you have to start somewhere. And so we started with survey, like a survey app is the simplest way to describe it. But the vision is actually much bigger than what we've even produced so far. And the idea is that if we can tap into understanding what it is that motivates people to buy, how they discover brands, all of that, we can start to create a really interesting set of data for brands to better understand how to reach customers more effectively. And so that was really the vision. And so over time, we started with the surveys, but I think you're going to see more and more. We started with simple surveys. We got really into attribution because there's a ton of demand around attribution, which has been amazing. Then more into things like CRO, and that's been really good too. But I think what you're going to see is more like how do we structure the data and how do we help brands tap into contextualizing it as well, and not just understanding like what it means in the context of their business, but what does that mean in terms of the broader context? And also like what are other pieces of data that are meaningful that kind of tie to survey data, but aren't necessarily survey data. So we're doing a lot more on kind of like the insight layer in the coming years. So it's a slow process. It's a much bigger challenge than writing some code to collect data, the actual like synthesis and understanding of it. But that is definitely what we're working towards.
So many interesting parts there. I mean, a million extra questions just came from that. But I love how complete your story is, I want to say as well, because you've had some experience with, doing your own startup, you've done your brand, you've done some agency work. So I think that you've got all of the experience you've got before some of the problems also you've probably noticed from your e-com store is now, one of the reasons why you came up with KnoCommerce and all that. So I find it always very interesting to see how an idea comes about, and KnoCommerce just came about a problem that you and your partner had, and now it's something just incredible. Like I say, I use on a daily basis. So
Awesome. Yeah.
that sounds super super exciting, and I'd love to go into more tactical things. If we go
Yeah.
on a broader part, just for the moment, let's say, or with your experience, what are some some of the most common mistakes people make when it comes to using post-purchase survey, which is
Yep.
actually reducing the amount of insights that they can get. They've got so much potentially important and valuable data. What are the mistakes people are making there?
Yeah, the biggest thing, honestly, is there's a fear that your customers are going to be annoyed by you running surveys and asking them questions. And there will be some for sure. Like there are people who we see the angry answers typed in the surveys. It happens, right? But the reality is that it's a very, very small percentage of people who actually get upset about it. We've even done tests before. There's a large brand you would know, 9 figures in revenue. They wanted to see if there was a difference in an NPS score based on like how aggressive they were with their surveys, and there was no difference. So there's even some things like that we've looked at, not scale, but at least for individual brands, kind of trying to evaluate this stuff. And so the biggest thing is, I think, don't be afraid to ask your customers questions and ask them a lot of questions. We literally have a brand, another like 9-figure brand that we work with. I think they have 19 questions on a single survey post purchase. And so literally customers go through and more than half of their customers answer all 19 questions. Sorry, more than half of the people that start it. I think it's I don't know, 30-40% that start the survey, but of those that start it, more than half of them fill out the entire survey. And people, what I think you is often underestimated is that people actually want to give feedback. They want to inform your product. They want to inform your roadmap. And surveys are a really easy way to give people that input. And so I usually tell people like, hey, don't be afraid to ask questions. So ask as many questions as are going to be useful to you. But then just think about the experience of the customer and make it feel like there's actually value that they're getting out of it as well, right? Like how by letting them make the language friendly, make it so that it's easy to take. So don't make it all open-ended questions. Make it so they can just click buttons to go through it, right? There's some things like that where make it simple, make it easy, and make it feel like they can actually tell you what they want to tell you. And that is all going to be really helpful. So that's usually my biggest thing is just don't be afraid to ask questions. I see so many brands that say, I'm just going to ask one question because I don't want to bother my customers. And it's like, well, if they're going to answer one question, they probably don't care if you ask them 5 questions. And the ones that don't want to answer the one question are never going to see that there's 5 questions. So just ask it, and you're leaving data on the table by not asking the questions.
Yeah, 100% wild. But 19 questions, that is wild though. I was always under the impression that 7 to 8 is the maximum.
Yeah.
From the data that you have, what's the sort of sweet spot, of having enough people answering it and then also keeping, well, you said actually it doesn't change in terms of like bothering people, but what's the sort of sweet spot of asking enough questions so that you can ask as many questions as you want, but also having the highest completion rate? Is there one?
Yeah. We honestly need to do a little bit more research on this because all of our numbers are from like 2 years ago. But what we used to tell people is 5 to 7 questions is a good range, where you're gonna typically with a survey of that length. If you're asking mostly like multiple choice questions, you're gonna see of those who start it, usually between 80 and 90% will finish the survey. So you will see drop off as you go. And one of the things that we were very intentional about from the beginning is that while we do have robust logic built into the surveys, so you can ask it as like a complete set of survey questions, we also collect every question response as you go. So if a customer only answers 3 out of 7 questions, you still get the data from those 3 questions, even if they don't finish. So that's another thing that I think helps a lot. Just because you have like on that brand I was telling you about, I think it's like 56% is their completion rate on the 19 questions. And so while only 56% of people are answering question number 19, you still get all 100% of the people who answered question number 1, right? Like you're still getting all that data. So your amount of data kind of drops as you go along throughout the course of the survey. But, in a context like that, I think they get, I want to say it's like 50,000 survey views a month or something like that. It's a good number. And so they're still collecting a massive amount of data, even if, only, let's say 5,000 people are finishing that full survey. It's still a ton of data that they're getting out of it. So, and actually I think it's more than that, but anyway, there's so there's not like a hard firm number, but obviously like the response rate will drop a little bit. So part of it depends too on how much do you need the data for all the questions. If you need, let's say there's 5 questions, you really need the data for those. Either just make it the survey those 5 questions, or start with those 5 questions and then add a few others at the end.
Okay. Yeah, it's actually something I believe a lot of people take for granted, is maybe having those first couple questions, even if they don't complete it, they still get the data from those 1, 2, 3 questions, which is so valuable. Even if they don't answer the last question, they still answer the first couple. It's super, super valuable. So that's already very interesting. What are then some deeper level features, I want to say, that most people that use KnoCommerce probably don't use, but if they actually did, they would unlock a whole new level of insights? Are there any of those features that people don't know should know about?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One doesn't necessarily get you more insight, but at what we call actions are really powerful. Basically, it's a way for you to put, and you've probably seen this in some contexts, but basically we can use either the responses of a question or just add a generic action into a survey, and you can ask somebody to do something. So for instance, you could have a link to join a VIP program. or to check out a refer a friend program or follow on social, whatever those things are. So that's a really powerful feature. We have brands we work with that are driving thousands of actions per month. And we actually have a case study we did with a Talkable, which does refer a friend programs, where they've seen no users driving massive increases in refer friend activity because of the actions. So that's a cool thing that it basically turns it into a revenue driving tool as opposed to just a data collection tool. On the data collection side, though, I think the most underrated feature is our audiences feature, and we use audiences in two different ways. So, and yeah, I know you're nodding your head, you know some of the stuff. So on audiences, you can use them to target surveys to specific people. So that's one thing that we is really powerful. We don't how large your brand is really, and like the order volume has a significant impact on how useful audiences are. But we have brands that have things like a Disney product line, right? Where they have I think one of the companies we work with, they have a whole set of products that's Harry Potter focused. So we can say, okay, let's show a survey to people who are buying a Harry Potter product, and ask them specific questions, or people who bought this new SKU that we just launched and ask them specific questions. So we have some brands that do this for like new product launches. They have a set survey template that they've built out. They just clone it each time that they have a new product launch coming out. They run it to that new product, and that gives them really interesting insight that they can kind of look at and each product individually and see why is it that people are choosing to buy this product, how are they hearing about it, all that kind of stuff. And then on the other side, for the reporting end of things, audiences are really cool. I love breaking it down in a couple of ways. One, looking at like number of orders. So you've got your standard set of questions you're asking. Let's say you have 10,000 people a month answering a survey, and you can look at the people who have purchased 10 plus times and see how they answer the survey questions versus people who are a new customer. And that can be really valuable data. Or another way that I love breaking that down, this is probably my favorite and most common use case, is actually looking at what they answered for a specific question compared to their answers on another question. So a good example of that is, let's say somebody said that they found you on TikTok. So that's the common use cases, asking a how did you first hear about us question. And then you have the question, how long did you know about us before placing your first purchase? So you can actually filter that question by people who said they found you on TikTok or people who said they found you on Google. And you can see that there's a difference in time to purchase by where they found you. So that kind of data can be really valuable. And even like on the CRO side, being able to break down the responses by things like purchase motivator, like was there something that like which these aspects of our product encourage you to buy today, breaking that stuff down by different groupings of data, all of that is really valuable. So I would say, the actions for driving activity, but also like the audiences for just filtering data and triggering surveys to specific users are really powerful.
I think that answer already alone can take any beginner to almost expert level, because that's super interesting. The one you mentioned where filtering by the amount of people or the amount of products bought, I did that the other day actually, and it was super interesting to see the different responses of some
Yeah.
friction points for people that bought the first time, or what
Mm.
motivated them. It was maybe, okay, the reviews looked good, those type of things. And
Mm.
people that bought three or more times, it was the quality, the taste, things like that. So it's just interesting to see the difference actually in
Yes.
terms of their responses, which, yeah, I
Yeah,
level.
and with that, the reason why that's important too is when you survey, let's say you have a mix of new and returning customers, right? And so, taste and quality, that's going to show up in your surveys. And so if you're not filtering out the data to look at what that actually looks like for different types of customers, then you might go out and you might actually have the wrong messaging on your acquisition for new customers when maybe you talk about taste, but it's actually like the packaging that people are interested in, right? Because they've never tried the product before. And so there's some interesting stuff there where like being able to break down that data by the type of customer has a really could potentially have a really big impact on how you actually use that information.
Yeah, 100%. And I find you're so right with that. You also said, at the beginning, different audiences. So just real quick, I was wondering, what's the ideal sort of, if there is an ideal, or how can you get as close to the right size for audiences? When does it make sense to filter down by audience, and when does it not make sense because the target, demographic is too small, actually?
Yeah, it's so man, there's so much nuance, right? But I would say like my general rule of thumb, and here's how like the way that we do our pricing, we don't charge by volume at all. We actually it's all feature based. But there's an element of like, well, which features are actually useful at which size. So we do think a lot about like how many orders a month or how many survey views a month make certain things useful. So what I usually look at is like if you're under, let's say, 1,000 survey or 1,000 orders a month, that means your volume on a post-purchase survey at least will be 1,000 or less. And so in that context, breaking down like maybe surveying or filtering the data by new versus returning customers makes sense. I think like that can be useful still at that size. But you probably don't want to be surveying based on like different products purchased. Like you just don't have enough data at that point to really be able to track trends over time. So, like sub 1,000 orders a month, we would say, generally speaking, like run one survey to one type of customer, or just generically to all your customers. And maybe you do a little bit of filtering by things like new versus returning customer, but you just don't have a massive data set. And so we kind of look at like 1,000 potential people in an audience per month as a good target, because then that gives you a good number of people who are going to respond. You're going to have hundreds of responses a month. You're going to be able to filter the data. So, once you get to like, let's say 2 to 5,000 orders a month, then you start doing a little bit more, new customer surveys, returning customer surveys, maybe VIP customer survey, those kinds of things. Surveying by, maybe you have a hero product that does 60% of your revenue and you want to run a survey for that versus other products. So we kind of look at like about 1,000 eligible people per month for a grouping of customers is about the right number. So, but there's nuance. I mean, it also depends on what you're asking too. So if all you want to do is do open-ended questions where you're letting people like write a paragraph and you want to go in and maybe use some AI to help interpret that, or you make it really open-ended and you're not really looking to track trends over time, then the numbers can be a lot smaller too. But if you're looking for like trend tracking, about 1,000 a month.
As I was asking that question, I was thinking, actually, that's a really stupid question to ask, but I'm glad I did because you gave some really, really good advice there and some good insight to
No,
get.
it's not stupid. It's hard because it's like there's again
Yeah,
like there it depends, but I think that's a good kind of a good rule of thumb.
definitely, 100%. Also, you often hear, with post-purchase surveys, it's great to have a clear idea of the user persona. You can learn more about the motivation, the anxieties, but also the user persona. I know Dylan Ander often talks about, the one that knows their customers best is the one that will ultimately win. So the more you know your exact user persona, since you are obviously limited with the amount of questions you can ask, you can go apparently up to 19, but not every brand maybe could go, that far.
Yeah.
How can you know as much as possible without being too overwhelming? And just, yeah, what's the general best approach when it comes to building out an accurate and clear understanding of your user persona to have that competitive advantage?
Yeah, it's challenging. So there's a couple of different approaches. I would say like for large brands, there's really no limit to how many questions you can ask, and you can kind of start to build out. I actually don't like the idea of building personas on an individual basis. I think that I shouldn't say I don't like it. I think there's value there for sure, but the reality is that because of the number of questions that you would need somebody to answer, and because of the response rate issues and people don't answer survey questions all the time, and we're also seeing on our side, we're doing research and we're seeing that there's even some response bias in terms of age and gender. So different ages and genders are less likely to answer surveys, right? So like we're looking at a bunch of this kind of stuff, and so the problem with the survey is you're always sampling. You're never going to get 100%, and so building like individual personalized experiences based off of that data is going to be really hard. Honestly, doing that based off of any data is really hard. Your best bet's probably using, ultimately, I think the technology is going to become better on this, but some sort of like AI to predict what might be true of someone based on what you do know about them. And so the way that I look at it is for like a bigger brand, we have one brand we work with. They had, I forget the exact number. It was a massive number of responses though, in a single month across 88 different questions being answered. So that 88 questions, unique questions that had answers in the month of, I think it was February that we were looking at. And they had a survey, they had like 5 different surveys on their order confirmation screen, depending on what type of profile they were targeting. They had surveys they're emailing out on a regular cadence. They had surveys that they had embedded on their site in the pre-purchase process. Like there was a bunch of different touch points, and then they're funneling all of that back into Klaviyo. So they have their customer profile in Klaviyo, and on that profile, they're passing the data in. So in that context, they're actually getting a pretty good sense of their customers on an individual basis because they're touching so many different points and because they have such a massive volume of customers. So that is one approach you can take. But I do think you have to be pretty big for that to work. The other thing that we're working on, though, and that I think will kind of help both large and smaller brands, is pulling in other types of data to help identify, again, kind of like contextualizing the data, like we talked about earlier. So if we can enrich the survey response data with third-party data, even if it's not necessarily like one-to-one accurate, but we're kind of getting like a sense of this type of person is probably, male, 35 to 44, with an income of $150,000 to $200,000. And they answered these questions, and you can do that in aggregate. You can start to get some really interesting insights. So that maybe doesn't help you personalize, but it does help you really understand different like demographic groupings of customers, what motivates them, where they're spending their time, all of that kind of stuff. So that's a big piece of what we're working towards right now.
Okay, that's super interesting. One of my follow-up questions, but I guess it sort of answers itself, is what are the best sort of type of questions to ask? Is it more open-ended, closed-ended? But again, I guess if listening to what you just said, it maybe depends on your audience, the demographic, the gender. Maybe sometimes a closed-ended question works better. Maybe open-ended question.
Yeah.
It depends, right? I'm guessing.
Yeah, I actually, so my number one recommendation for that is just like the size of your business. So if you are, let's say you're doing 100 orders a month. So like when I had my own D2C brands, I don't remember what my biggest month was, but it was around that, right? Like 100, 200, 300 orders a month, something like that was kind of like the range we were in. And I got survey responses. And it was interesting, but like the reality is the most valuable thing to do is just ask open-ended questions and let people tell me whatever they want to tell me. And that is going to be more useful just because you're going to get more explicit feedback and you're going to get feedback on things that you're not thinking about. Whereas if you're, like some of the brands we work with that have 100,000 plus orders a month, like in that context, you actually don't want to sift through all that feedback. Even if you do want to use AI, like, do you really need, 20,000 open-ended responses? The answer is no. It doesn't actually tell you anything unique at a certain point. So you're better off tracking data that you can look at on a monthly basis and really like track the trends, see how things are changing as you're scaling up TV ads, let's say. Is that are you seeing TV increase as a driver of conversion? And maybe at the same time you're seeing price as a concern for people not hesitating on their purchase changing as well. Like that kind of stuff is where the value really comes in for larger brands, not so much the open-ended. So that's generally my recommendation, is like wherever you are in that cycle of not cycle, like there's kind of a what am I trying to say? There's a
Yeah,
scale there, and wherever you are on that scale,
yeah,
that's going to dictate like how much of your questions are open-ended versus like multiple choice.
yeah, definitely. And also, I agree with that. And thank God for AI, because imagine 20,000 questions and you have to go through that manually. I don't think anyone
Yeah,
would want to be the person for the job there.
no, and the thing too is like I don't know if you've ever done this, but I've taken data like that and plugged in, 100 answers into AI versus 2,000, and the outputs are exactly the same, right? So there's also that where it's like maybe not exactly, but like it's basically the same. There's not really much difference, and that a sample, you don't need a very large sample to get meaningful insights.
True. Yeah, I agree. I saw the same there. I was wondering, and again, maybe it's a little bit the similar type of questions, but often people say a post-purchase survey, you're getting response from a percentage of a percentage. People that bought, that took the time to fill in the survey, and that did it, all the way, even though the first couple of questions, like we just said, are being tracked anyway. How do you sort of decide when you need to act on some of the data you're seeing? Because like, okay, maybe enough people are complaining about this part of the website, or they're talking about what motivated them there. And
Yeah.
how do you just think, okay, this is an outlier, we shouldn't really focus too much on this? How do you sort of differentiate the two, maybe more as well for smaller brands, because they have maybe less of that data coming in?
I mean, generally speaking, so the challenge with that specific type of data, like problems, is that usually you're not going to get that insight from like a multiple choice question. You
Mm-hmm.
need to let somebody type in an answer in order to get information about new problems. So there's a couple of things there. One, like I recommend, generally speaking, I recommend brands have an other option on a lot of questions, depending on what you're doing. But like most questions should have an other option where you can let somebody type in an answer. If it's something like how long, like one question we commonly have brands asking is, how long did you know about us before placing your first purchase? And it's basically anything from less than a day to 12 plus months. There's no reason for an other option because they should be in one of those buckets, right? But if it's a, did you have any issues with purchasing today? And you've got, price and checkout issue or whatever those things are, you should at least be asking follow-up questions to those and also having another option if you're doing something like that. And then the size of the business obviously has an impact, but like if you do actually have an option, like one thing we've seen before, was one brand, I was looking at their data and they had an issue with, I think it was a firm. It was one of those pay enforced installments options. And then multiple customers reporting that they clicked to go to a firm and then wanted to just purchase. They changed their mind. They didn't want to do the 4 payment installment thing, and they couldn't get back. They didn't know how to actually get back to the website and to purchase just a one-time purchase. So when you see something like that multiple times, then you know that you have an issue there. But on smaller brands, the reality is like, let's say you have 100 orders a month, you get 50 people to start your survey, 10 people to actually answer the question of, did you have any issues today? If one of them says that they had an issue with a specific, like if they're detailed and they tell you, I had this issue with this thing, just go look at it. Like there's no reason not to, right? And see if you can also see the issue. And if you can't, spend a few minutes on it. If you can't replicate their issue, then find it, move on, see if it pops up again. But I would say, like, generally speaking, if customers are being that explicit about things, it's worth looking at them at the very least, even if it's not something that you can replicate. See if it's something you can replicate. And then if it keeps popping up, then you have an issue that you need to dive deeper on.
Okay. Yeah. Again, very complete answer, very, very valuable as well. And I agree. Sometimes you see a lot of responses with just one or two words, and then you see one big one where they explain their whole
Yes.
life story almost and how it frustrated them.
Yeah.
But often there's a lot of good value in those
Yep.
responses. So, like you say, take that extra time to actually look into it, and maybe you
Yeah.
could uncover something super interesting. You
Mhm.
you mentioned the 19 questions not impacting the NPS score. Are there any sort of tips or best sort of approaches in terms of setting up an NPS survey to understand a little bit more how people think about the brand? Because I think that's also interesting, maybe in the longer term picture for brands.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good question. So there's kind of two approaches you can take up an NPS. I don't recommend NPS on a new customer. So generally, I mean, it just doesn't make much sense, right? You could ask an alternative to that, which is basically like a how was your purchase experience? And we have both NPS and scale questions in our system, which they're the same thing. It's just that scale is we don't do the NPS calculation on it, and it is a open-ended. You can choose the number of options, but so for a new customer, you could say, how was your experience today? But for returning customers, NPS is an interesting one. At that point, they should have tried your product before, or at least are familiar with it, and
Mhm.
they could be interested in making a recommendation of your product. And that's really what you're looking for is like, is this person a promoter or detractor, right? Like, would they be somebody who would promote your product? And so asking that question of returning customers can make sense. At least we believe it does. But what's really interesting then is give them the ability to give you more based on their response to that question. So if they are a detractor, so, you know, one, two, I forget what the exact numbers are, but basically, like if they're in that category where they are or neutral, ask them for more feedback and potentially even pipe that data into something like a Klaviyo, where you can send it off to somebody on your support team to reach out to them specifically. So that's really helpful just to get a little bit more information from them there. And then if they are a promoter, somebody who really loves your brand, 9, 10, even an 8 sometimes, give them the ability to leave a review, join a referral program, something like that. So you can actually, in context, use that data to push them into that. So that's one approach. I think the best version of an NPS is actually sending it to somebody after they've received the product, and I've had a chance to use the product. And so we can do that as well. Basically, you know, you just set up an email flow from Klaviyo, you send them a link to take the survey, they can click on the survey, go in and fill it out, but do the same thing, right? If they're a detractor, get more feedback, ask them why. If they're a promoter, push them to actually promote at that moment, as opposed to just asking if they are. Because that's the most valuable opportunity, right? If somebody tells you 10 out of 10, I love your brand, I'm going to promote you, and then you say, okay, cool, do you want to promote us right now? That's going to be a lot more effective. And we've seen that be really effective for driving reviews for brands. So that's a good approach.
As you're saying, it makes sense, but it's true. You don't always think about it. You know, if people they're detractors, I think it's maybe 1 to 4 or 5. Why? You know, just learn
Yeah.
about it. And like you said, if they're saying I love your brand, I would definitely support you and give a review. Like, okay, great, well, please and do give a review. You know, it just makes
Yep.
sense, and the timing is really good.
And I think this is true of almost every business. There are obviously businesses that like are ill-intentioned, but the vast majority of us, you know, myself on the SaaS side, you with what you're doing, the brands we work with, all of us are trying to do the best job we can for our customers. That's just the reality. Like none of us are trying to give them a bad experience. And so when you know that somebody has a bad experience, that is the perfect opportunity to try to fix it. And most of the time, we don't get that opportunity, right? Or I shouldn't say most of the time, but oftentimes we don't get the opportunity to actually fix something. So take advantage of that. Like use that as much as you can. Jump in there, do whatever you can, and you may take that person who's a detractor and turn them into a promoter the next time they take that survey.
True. Yeah, very true. I don't remember who said it. I don't think it was Robert Cialdini, but a negative, I think it was maybe in his book, Persuasion, or I might be completely off here, but a negative experience can easily be turned into a positive if you just take the time to actually try and transform that. You know, last question
Yep.
I have then on post-purchase surveys. I don't want to bore you too much with it. I feel that talked a lot about that. Is so now we have a lot of knowledge about or more at least how you can collect more information about the user persona. Like you said, you know, you can try and maybe get different pieces of data and try to have a rough idea as to who it is. How do
Mhm.
you learn more about the motivation side? You know, how do you collect data on what motivates people, and how can you make sure that the
Yep.
data you're getting is actually valuable and it's not them just responding quickly and you can't really do anything with it?
Yeah, that is there. So there's two ways that I think about the motivation side of things. One is what motivates them to purchase from your brand specifically. So that's one type of question. And the other one is what motivates them to purchase in general. On the specific side, the only way to get that information is by asking specific things about your brand or your products. The reality is that there's always going to be a very small percentage of people who don't take surveys seriously. They skip things. They just click whatever option. That does happen for sure. I think the data that we've looked at, the it's not there. There are people out there that will make you think that's the the standard behavior, but that actually is not the standard behavior. It's a small percentage. It's probably 2-3% of survey responses that will come through like that, and it probably will just get most of the time get caught in the noise of everything else that's going on. So you know, I think just making it easy to answer that question is the best way to do it. If you have the right brand, sometimes asking open-ended questions that are a little bit more fun and engaging can be really valuable. So it's brand dependent though. Like if you're there's a company we work with that's I think they're like subscription bread. Like it's just like they have, and I actually don't even know if they're asking questions like this, but it's something where like people are avid fans. They have an insane survey response rate. Like it's wild. And so a company like that, they can ask their customers basically anything, and they'll have customers answer those questions. And so for those people, I think getting at motivations by with some open-ended stuff can be really valuable. But a lot of times you're not going to get good responses if you're just kind of like a brand that people don't love, right? Um, like I just bought, what was it? I bought a camera the other day, like a webcam camera, and I have no affinity to the brand. I have no interest in like it's interesting, but like it's just a piece of tech. I bought it because it's the most interesting piece of technology, not because I'm like a raving fan of their brand. And so I'm not going to answer their survey in the same way that I would if I was a raving fan, right? So anyway, there's that. The other piece of data that's really interesting though, and this is where like talking about the context piece becomes valuable, is we actually have a survey experience that we call automated insights, and it's still in beta. Honestly, will be for a while. We're still optimizing and tuning, but we actually ask questions that get at demographics, purchase motivations, where customers spend time online, and all of that. And then we aggregate all that data across all the brands that are asking those questions. So you can actually see your customers, if they say that they're motivated by price, like a low price, or if they're motivated by reviews, or they're motivated by recommendations from friends and family in terms of what they purchase. You can actually see that in the context of all of the people answering these questions. And the reality is that that data point in and of itself isn't that interesting, right? Like reviews are the number one thing that people select. What is interesting is your customer different than the average? Because that tells you something. And so that's the other piece of data that I think is really valuable here in terms of motivations. If you can understand how your customers' motivations differ from the standard sort of set, that tells you something, and gives you a little bit more insight into how you might want to speak to your customers.
I know one thing I'm going to do 100% after this is rewatch all of this because there are so many things I'm sure I didn't even maybe remember it because there's so much. But one thing I'm definitely picking up here is I remember the first ever post-purchase show I did, which was a long time ago. I was a bit like,
Mhm.
okay, let me just Google quickly what are the best questions. Here they
Yep.
are. And it's going to be like this, copy and paste it all the time. But what I'm getting here is, and it just makes a lot more sense, is actually really adapted so much more to what do you want to know? You know, what's like you said, what's the
Yep.
phase of the business in? What exactly are
Yep.
you struggling with? How can you ask the questions? How much are the fans or the customers really raving fans, or is it a bit of a cold audience? So you need to be a little bit more
Yep.
professional. So that's super interesting. And definitely very, very valuable, I think, for everyone listening to just get better, ask better questions to get better, responses.
Yeah.
Going,
And it's hard to do, honestly, just to be clear. Like it's hard to know sometimes until you start asking what things you should be asking. So that's another piece too. Like just start somewhere, get some data. And what it should do is when you see the results, it should give you more questions. You should start to ask internally, at least say, okay, well, but what does this actually mean? And that's where you can really start to unlock the real value, is to then ask the question that helps you unlock that insight.
agreed, 100%. One just quick example is with a closing brand is at the beginning it was a bit unclear like what kind of questions do we need to ask. Asking just some
Mhm.
questions, people were like, okay, well we're not sure about this or maybe the size. You're like, oh, okay, we didn't really know that. And then from that you can
Mhm.
ask questions deeper into how can you tell this is the right size? What makes you tell it's like good quality? So yeah,
Yeah.
I love that idea of just start asking questions and from there you'll know a little
Mhm.
bit clearly. If we
Yeah, absolutely.
go a little tiny bit back um, to the beginning, with your entrepreneurship journey, I was wondering, you've through these years of experience and you've got like so many lessons learned from that with all your knowledge. If you had to now start all over again, right? And the only thing you can keep is the knowledge that you have and the experience, right? Nothing
Yeah.
else. How would you go about starting a company now? What would be your sort of logical? Okay, these are my next steps that I need to follow.
It depends a little bit on what I'm looking to achieve. So I think there's like one of the things is there are problems you can, if you want to make money, and a lot of money, go look for boring problems that are expensive, right? Like the reality is, like, if you want to in this space, like starting like what's a good example? Like some sort of upsell service where you take a percentage of revenue. Like there's nothing you're not doing anything earth-shattering with that. It already exists, but it's relatively easy to build a brand around that, insert yourself into the space, and take large pieces of revenue, because you're in a position where you're generating a lot of revenue for a business, right? So there's problems like that. So like having that knowledge of that's one approach is to find a problem like that where you can charge a lot of money.
Mhm.
Um, there's that angle. I think the answer, like, I don't know what I would do, but I think the first thing I would do is I would say, okay, well, what is the problem I want to solve? Um, who is having this problem? And then can I go to those people and sell them on a solution, whether it's getting the money or not, but basically saying like, hey, here's a solution to this problem. Are you interested? And then it's a question of like, is this something that's like that, where it's like, I'm going to charge a bunch of money for it and I'm going to go get 100 customers and that's it? Or it's I'm going to, you know, charge $15 a month for a reviews app. That's better than, like the Judge Me route. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they've got a great solution for $15 a month and 300,000 merchants, I think they said that use it. So that's the other kind of end of it. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing where you're basically like going to somebody and saying, what's your problem? Here's my solution. Is this something you'll pay for? And here's how much. That would be my approach. I think too often I in the past I would get down the road of actually building something, um, and not first learn how to sell it.
Yeah, I love that answer. It makes sense as well. Sometimes you see people that they started something. It's like you're not really solving a big problem here. So I love the
Yep.
approach of, okay, what's the problem? If there's a
Mhm.
problem, you already know that people are willing to pay money for it. What is
Mhm.
the size of that problem there? So we've got some
Yep.
some rapid fire questions. Just before we
Okay.
go into those, last question I was wondering, and then this is going to be maybe another stupid, impossible one, but if you could only ever ask one question in a post-purchase survey, what question would that be?
I would it would probably be something to the effect of why did you buy today? Um, so some sort of phrasing around that. If I was going to pick one thing, that would be it, and it'd be open-ended, and I'd let you tell me whatever you wanted to tell me.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so you're asking a question, but you're allowing them to say whatever they want and not being too
Whatever
deep.
they want. Yep. And then the trick is analyzing that on the back end. But I think you would learn so much if you just ask that one question and then analyze the data.
That is a smart one. So from 19 all the way to 1, and you get a lot of data. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Just get it. Yeah. Let them tell you whatever they want to tell you. Could be things about their family, could be things about where they found you. Who knows? But yeah.
that's a very good one. That's a very good one. I didn't know how you were going to answer that one, but it's a very, very good answer. Okay, into the rapid fire questions now. If you could have dinner with anyone that has ever lived, who would it be and why?
Oh man. Uh there's so many options, but I'm gonna pick this guy. Tim Keller is his name. He died last year. I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but he
Sorry.
was a he's actually from New York. He was a pastor in New York, who was just like a really interesting guy who I would have loved to have met, and he passed away last year of cancer.
Sorry to hear that. But interesting answer, though. Interesting answer. What is your favorite book?
Oh man. I don't have a favorite book. I will say, so I used to read like business books and stuff. Lately, I've just been reading, if I read something, I just read like mystery novels or things like that. Like something that's just fun and light, and I don't have to think too much. So that's gonna be my answer. Just anything that is entertainment, I guess. I'm all about that right now.
Nice. Okay, good one. Proudest moment of your career?
To this point, probably like selling. Oh, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but we sold KnoCommerce 2 years ago to a holding company out of Canada. Like getting through that process of building something that somebody wanted and um, and closing that deal. I think that's probably like that's the number one thing. But there's also so many things that I think are actually more meaningful. If that makes sense, like on the in terms of like actually impactful things. But for me internally, I think that was the thing that is kind of the most exciting moment for me.
I can imagine. Yeah, building something to the point where you can sell it. Very, very quick
Mhm.
follow-up question on that. I was speaking the other day with someone that actually sold their own CRO agency, And they told me that
Hmm.
the moment where you know it's officially sold, it's been acquired, he said for him it was the most anticlimactic moment in his life because it's just like, okay, it's done. Maybe you get an email confirmation and that's it.
Uh,
Was it a little bit like that, or was it a little bit more eventful for you and you can actually sort of celebrate?
yeah, mine was a little bit more eventful. So we actually had I signed, I got on a plane and I flew to Miami to meet the people that acquired our business and hung out with them for the evening. So it was more fun. Um, yeah, I think it's the I would agree the signing itself, you just sign a piece of paper, but the fact that I got to have like there was a bit of an event to it was really nice.
Okay, that's good to hear. Yeah, nice. You could celebrate a little bit more, so just thinking, okay, that's it. Let's just move on now. Next thing.
Yeah.
Last question is, if you could give yourself one piece of advice to your younger self, what would that be?
Yep. Yeah, this is something that I I think about a lot. It's just have patience. And so I think when I was younger, I was very impatient. I had this idea when I was 20 years old, starting my first company, that I was going to be a billionaire by the time I was 30 and the next Mark Zuckerberg and all this stuff. And that hasn't materialized. And I'm probably better
Yeah.
for it not having materialized. Um, but I think that I also would have been a millionaire 5 years ago if I would have just stuck with my first business. So not my first one, my first successful business. Instead of selling when I did. So I think there's a lot of like good things take time. It takes time to compound. And even, for what we've done at KnoCommerce, we sold 2 years ago and we were a year and a half old, but that wasn't a sale in terms of I'm ready to be done with this thing. I want out. It was we need the resources to get to the next level. And so even in that context, I have a very clear plan of what I want to accomplish over the next 5 to 10 years. And I know that showing up every day, doing your best, being patient is the thing that ultimately is going to create something really meaningful, not just getting lucky and capturing lightning in a bottle.
It isn't just like sorry, advice to your younger self. It's just incredible advice as well for me. I find it's just some things that I'm also very impatient. Just hearing you explain it. You have a lot more experience, a lot more maturity as well behind it. So great advice as well for me. So thank you very much, Jeremiah. You've been
Super.
amazing. I'm really excited just to rewatch this episode and just take notes because there's so much value from it. I'm also excited to be implementing some of those things you mentioned tomorrow or even maybe tonight. I might just hop on NewCommerce real quick.
Well, let me know if you have questions. Happy to jump in and support you on anything there.
You very much. I appreciate that. For those that want to continue the conversation with you, that have maybe other questions that I want to connect with you, where is the
Mhm.
best place to connect or follow you?
Yeah, so Twitter, I guess X, just Jeremiah Prummer, first last name. And same with LinkedIn. Those are probably the two best places to reach me. Honestly, I'm slightly more responsive there than my email because my email inbox is just a nightmare. And I'm sure someday those things will turn into a nightmare too, and it'll also be hard to reach there. But that's the best place to reach me is just message me on one of those platforms.
Love it. Okay, Jeremiah, you're a beast. Thank you so much for your time. Loved it.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate this time, Chris.
Love it. Thank you.